Hey, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Cody. I'm still the new guy. That hasn't changed. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll give you that $20 for clapping. Thank you. They said last week went decently well, so come on back this week. I said, okay, that's great to know. So we're anchored. We're so good to be here, and it's great to be with you all. Last week we started a series called the Uncharted journey, talking about moments where we experience kind of this moment in time where we don't feel like God's maybe present, or we're on a path that we don't know how it's going to end. We looked at the story of Abram in Genesis chapter 12, leaving everything that he knows, everything that's familiar to him, to be faithful, obey God, and take off into the unknown. And we said that God, as a church, will show us the way. As individuals and as a community, will show us the way forward, and that he invites us to put our lives at the altar of God, saying, hey, take my life, lead us where you want to direct us. And so today we're jumping into another incredible book. But I want to begin with a story of a prominent American lawyer and businessman from the 19th century. His name's Horatio Spafford. This is what he looks like. And his story is really complex. His life was marked with a series of tragic events that had happened, and it tested his faith, it tested his resilience quite a bit. In fact, in 1871, his young son died of the scarlet fever. Shortly after that same year, the great Chicago fire broke out, and it devastated all of his real estate and left his family in financial ruins. Fast forward some time later, and his wife and him were talking, and they felt that they needed a break from all that had happened to them, so they were going to go to Europe. And at the very last minute, Spafford could not go on the trip, so his wife went and his 4 daughters. And along the way, tragedy hit again. The vessel that they were in hit another vessel, and it sunk, and his wife was the only survivor. He lost his 4 daughters. Horrible. Absolutely tragic on a scale I'm sure many of us can't even imagine. Today, we're looking at a similar story in many ways. It's in the book of Ruth. And so if you're here, pull out your Bibles. If you could pull out your blue Bibles in front of you in the pews there, we're going to be starting in page 372. This is another story in the Uncharted journey. And this morning, we're going to look at Ruth. It's an incredibly written book that over the course of simply 4 chapters shows us the incredible faith of Ruth, but more importantly, all pointing to God's redemptive mission and plan in the world. The book of Ruth can be broken down into really 4 scenes. We don't get to, or we don't have the time to get into all of them. I wish we did. We will have a Ruth series because it backs such a bunch. And so we're going to begin in Ruth chapter 1, again, page 372 in your blue Bibles. Chapter 1 begins with this, in verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion, they also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Really awful story. Let me allow me to set the stage for what's happening in this first scene in Ruth. In rapid succession, you'll find in this story that it goes from bad to worse. And by worse, I mean it actually gets dire in this moment. They have to leave everything that they know, everything that's safe, all because of a famine. And so they move to a place and away from a place that they know and they love, and a place where they grew up. Everything is familiar to them. And they have to go to Moab, and Moab was actually a dangerous place. It wasn't the greatest place for people to be. There's a long history between Israel and the Moabites that points to just absolute conflict. And can you imagine how the family's feeling? They just have to get up and go all because of a famine. It would have been a little bit of a humiliating moment for Elimelech, so he couldn't pull it off. Couldn't pull it off in Bethlehem. And unlike Abram's story of not knowing where he's going to land, they know where they're going. And it's not the place they really want to be. It's all because of food. And now Naomi, she's in this dire situation with the death of her husband and her sons, and she's left with only her daughter-in-laws, foreigners, Moabites. And Moabites were frowned upon. Moabites had a really bad reputation. You could turn to a few pages in Numbers and Deuteronomy, and you could see that right away. And the fact that her sons married Moabite women, it's actually a little bit scandalous. And in this culture, when you became a widow, life became difficult for you because your family was actually your 401k. It was your health insurance policy. You lived in this familial tribal unit where everything was codependent. You depended on your husband, your sons, your daughters, and she's lost all of that. We find Naomi in a dire situation and things look bleak and absolutely uncertain for her. Things have gone all wrong since they've come to Moab and since her sons have married Moabite women. In fact, one theologian says, paradoxically, the two daughters-in-law who might seem to be the symbol of everything that has gone wrong are actually the two people who might be able to help Naomi find her healing. Terrible start to a story. And so now we turn to scene number 2, where we might just see a glimmer of hope and possibly the start of a new chapter for Naomi. As we read, picking up in the very next verse, in verse 6, when it reads this: when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and she set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. When Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. I want to pause for a moment. That word kindness is the Hebrew word hesed. Can you say that with me? Hesed. That was okay. Can you try again? Hesed. Yeah, there you are. There you are. And it means steadfast love. So make a note of that. Steadfast love. We'll come back to that. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go with your people. Amazing moment in this story. It appears that the famine is over, that Naomi actually gets to go home, gets to be back to the place that she knows well, that is familiar. I mean, could life actually start over for her? Could this be a restart? Could it be the start of something new? It's been at least 10 years since leaving, and I wonder if Naomi is thinking that if we never moved, we would have been just fine. We should have never left. And now she has to go back. And after all this, they couldn't pull it off in Moab either. Could be another humiliating moment. It's going to be lonely, and worst of all, life is never going to be the same. No husband, no sons. Life will never be the same. And you might find yourself in this story today. That for you have maybe lost a loved one, or family has moved away, and life just doesn't seem the same for you. It's changed so much that all you've experienced is maybe loss over the last few years. Loss is really painful, and loss is really hard. And so this presents a really challenging moment for Naomi. I'm sure she's overwhelmed, and at the core of what she's feeling, she's really experiencing loss. In the depth of her soul, she's experienced a huge gaping hole in her heart. So she does what any good mother-in-law would do. She sends her daughters back to where they're from. Go back to your families. Go back to what is safe. Go back to what you know. And stay in Moab. Stay with the safety of your family. And if you're one of those daughter-in-laws, I'm sure you're experiencing a little bit of grief and confusion and sadness. And don't miss the tension in this moment. They have been together for 10 years. They have endured a lot of hardship together, some really tough decisions. They face an enormous, big decision. Do they stay or do they go? And if they go, it's completely normal and acceptable in this culture and really appropriate. We know that Orpah leaves to go back with her family, and then something really incredible happens in this moment. Ruth says what I think we all want to hear in our hopeless and desperate moments when we experience loss. She says this, starting just ahead in verse 16 of chapter 1. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I'll go, and where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. What's happening in this moment is Ruth is putting her faith and her hope in the God of Israel. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your God will become my God. It's almost as if we hear a little bit of God in her voice. As we know, God never leaves us or forsakes us. He is always with us. Which leads me to my first point, if you're a note taker. Some of you note takers are going, yes, there it is. God always provides what we need. God always provides what we need. Not what we want, but what we need. And whether Naomi realizes it or not, she needs Ruth, and Ruth needs her. And so they begin this journey together, and God provides the most unlikely person, Ruth, to walk with her on this journey. We all need community. We all need people in our lives. This is how God has hardwired us, and we need others. And I got a glimpse of that with this community this past week. How many of you are part of the Sharpies group? Yeah, there you are. You guys are partiers. I know you are. Yeah. Our family went to the Sharpies event over at the Groves, and we showed up, and there was this massive barbecue of like 50 people. And I said to my wife, oh, they're doing things right. This is awesome. They're sharing food together. There was a trivia game, and I promise you my family probably got the lowest score at trivia. We were terrible. They were playing Jimmy Buffett. There was songs, Margaritaville. I'm like, I have found my people. There's lawn bowling off into the distance. I told my wife, I'm like, how soon can we get into this community? We may not hit that mark just yet. But here's the beautiful thing. As I'm with this group and I'm talking with a lot of them, I keep hearing story after story of how they've done life together. Story of loss and births. And they knew all about each other's lives. They're walking with each other. They're doing life with each other. And I said to my wife, and it still gives me goosebumps, I said, this is the first century church. Hot dogs, burgers, I mean, this is it. It was powerful, it was beautiful. You would have saw a handful of men up here a few weeks ago with me, or not a few weeks, last week. It feels like a few weeks. We're still not moved in, but we'll get there. Last week, men who have walked with me through some of the hardest, most difficult seasons of my life, just praying, encouraging. They have been the Ruths in my life, and many of you are experiencing that together in this place. Really cool to see that. God always provides what we need. The two women are now on a 75-mile journey to Bethlehem, and they arrive at the end of chapter 1 as the barley harvest was beginning. And if we were to put this distance into our culture and our context, it would be like all of us walking from here all the way to Palm Springs, to give you an idea of what that would look like. Naomi's heading home, but again, it's just not going to be the same. Often in the Uncharted journey, we always find ourselves in difficult and in hopeless positions at times. In fact, in many ways, when we go through these changes and these hard moments, they actually change us. And Naomi's still in that hard place. She's filled with sorrow and pain, and now she wants to be called Marah because that means bitter. She is still bitter inside. She's angry and she's frustrated with God. And in verse 21, she says, I went away full, but the Lord brought me back empty. She doesn't mince words with the Lord. She brings it to the Lord, and that should give you permission to do the same. And despite how Naomi feels about God, what she cannot see yet, but eventually will, is that God has provided. He has provided on her journey. She's not alone. God has provided Ruth, a Moabite of all people. And you cannot miss this. And this tells us something. It tells us that God can use anybody or anything along our journey. Might be the one thing we didn't think God provided us with or needed, but God can use anybody along the way, and he uses her. In our story of Ruth, it doesn't end. In fact, there's still really a lot of questions that remain. How is it going to be like coming back to Bethlehem? Is she going to be okay? How are they going to receive them coming back into this place? And so we pick up in our third scene in the first verse in chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man standing there with the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. We know from previous chapters this was the start of the barley harvest. The barley harvest was one of the largest harvests of the year, generally happened in April. The crops were huge, and it was the most widely grown crop. It was the staple of the poor in this particular community. So God brought Ruth and back at the biggest harvest of the year, and they arrive not in the middle of it, not at the end of it, but right at the beginning, which tells you there's going to be plenty of food for them. Do you see the provision of the Lord already? Do you see the timing of the Lord already in this story? And so Ruth does what is customary for this culture. She gleans the harvest, which means she takes whatever's left over from it. And the Lord's provision continues, and we find Boaz has entered the story. In fact, he arrives, he announces, "The Lord be with you." His greeting to the harvesters is like the greeting of the presence of the living God. He is a man of God, and I don't think it's by accident that the barley harvest is happening at this particular moment. In fact, if it wasn't happening, I don't know if Ruth and Boaz would have actually met, which leads me to my second point. God's timing is perfect. God's timing is perfect. Within his provision, his timing is perfect, and it's never on our time. It's never on our time. I experienced God's provision and his perfect timing through my discernment journey from St. Andrews to Atlanta, Georgia. I had shared with you that along the way, we had gone to Peachtree Press. I had interviewed in that church, and my wife and I felt like we weren't called there. We weren't supposed to be there at that time. So we came back, and we were about a year into my time at St. Andrews that was left. And I had about 3 months left, and I came to the pastor, and I said, I feel like I'm supposed to leave, like this chapter is supposed to end. So I gave notice without anything lined up, just like what everybody else does in life, right? Nothing lined up, you give your notice, let's go. Yeah. That's just how I got all my gray hair. We prayed a lot about this. And then I had my very last trip, and this was in June, to have a supai down in the Grand Canyon with about 80 students. In fact, Jay's kids had gone on that trip a handful of times. They survived. And I'd gone on 60 trips in 6 years. I was tired, and nothing had really gone poorly on those trips. All those students are alive, praise the Lord. And on this trip, it started out a little poorly. Flat tire right off the get-go. I thought, oh, that's not a good sign. Within the first 30 minutes, one of my leaders, Molly, who was here last week, she rolled her ankle. So I had to drive her 3 hours back to a certain part of Arizona that had an ER, Kingman, Arizona. Checks out, she's okay. We go all the way back, and it's too late to hike in, so we got to wait for the helicopter another 3 hours. We go in on the helicopter, which I did not love any bit of that. We land, we're okay. We finally settle in. We have a couple of good days with the students going to waterfalls and different places, and then on the third night, one of the students just lets out a yell. And now, mind you, they would eat their food by using jet boils, boil up water really hot, and then pour in freeze-dried food, and then you'd eat it. She had spilt water on her leg. First-degree burn. 30 minutes later, kid you not, second kid spills water on their leg. Second-degree burn. This one's worse. And I'm going, what are we doing, people? We've done this before. And then the night we're actually going to leave, one of the students gets stung by a scorpion. And he looks at me, he goes, "Am I going to be okay?" And I had no clue. I said, "What color was it?" And he goes, "I think it was clear." I said, and I totally lied. I said, "I think you're going to be fine. I think you're going to be fine." In my head, I'm going, is this kid going to die on me? That's not a good way to go out. So I'm having to figure out how to get the first degree burn kids out safely because they cannot really walk that well. I have to figure out the scorpion sting, is he going to be okay? Long story short, we get to the top of the canyon. Now, mind you, the helicopter wasn't even running the rest of the week, so there was no way that was going to work. God had provided someone to take one of the girls up. She was safe. She was fine. Scorpion thing turned out to be okay. We get to the canyon, we're fine. All the kids are safe. And I get this sense, and it wasn't a booming voice from the Lord. It was just this deep, heartfelt gut feeling. That's the only way I can explain it. God saying to me, everything will work out for you. It'll happen in the last hour. Just trust me. It'll happen in the last hour. August hits. My paycheck is ending in just a few weeks. I'm talking to my wife, and I'm praying. I go, "Lord, I don't know what we're going to do, Roz." She goes, "What about Peachtree?" And I said, "That's been on my heart lately, actually." And she goes, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "Well, I'll text them, but I'll see if there's maybe a church opening here in California." So I text Peachtree. It's been a year now, mind you. And at this point, I'm thinking they've probably hired someone. It's too late. Next thing I know, pastor says, "When can you fly out?" I flew out. It's August 20-something. And I get on campus at Peachtree, and all of a sudden, I just felt like this feels right now. This feels like this is supposed to be where we're to land. Call my wife on the phone. I freak out with her. I'm like, I don't know what we're supposed to do. Then I fly back to Orange County. I get off the jetway, and I hear these soft words, well done, good and faithful servant. Called my wife. I said, we're supposed to be in Georgia. No doubt in my mind. So she's crying on the other end because she doesn't want to leave SoCal. And I'm like, this is where the Lord is calling us. And I don't want you to think I hear God's booming voice all the time. I don't. But in that moment, it just seemed crystal clear. We were supposed to go to Georgia. God provided all that I needed, not in the ways I wanted or the ways I expected, especially in the canyon. But what played out is more a bigger, significant role in my discernment process. That God's discernment journey took me to Peachtree, and then from Peachtree, that discernment process aligned and actually brought me back here with all of you. God's timing is perfect. God's provision is always there. Not only does God provide what we need, his timing is perfect. And so in the process of picking over the fields, she meets Boaz. He shows her kindness and protection. And Ruth even asks him later on in verse 10, why have I found so much favor in your eyes that you noticed me a foreigner? And that word favor is the Greek word grace. Why are you showing me so much grace? I'm a foreigner. And Boaz replies in verse 11 of chapter 2. He goes on to say this to her. I've been told about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you didn't know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And I wonder if this moment, if she quite possibly for the first time is experiencing the peace of God through Boaz. That he is God's representative. And I wonder if Naomi at this point is connecting to, or Ruth is connecting to the point that she's actually following the one true God. That the God of Israel actually might be real, that he might be trustworthy, that he actually might be good. And maybe at this point, she truly feels the weight and the feeling of the words she has said before. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And I wonder if at this point it is just all aligning for her. Your people will be my people. And now we've head to the final scene in this story. There's a lot that happens in chapter 3 that we can't get into. But what we find in this moment is that Boaz becomes their guardian redeemer. The guardian redeemer was a close relative who would help carry on the deceased family legacy, whether through acquiring the land or marrying someone. And so we find that Boaz takes basically Elimelech's land in a good way. Naomi's land. He marries Ruth, she becomes pregnant, and she has a boy. And so we'll jump to chapter 4 in verse 16, a very powerful text, when it says this, Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Aminadab. Aminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Solomon. Solomon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David. Did you catch that? A story that involves the faith of a non-Israelite, a non-believer, a Moabite, that leads to the birth of a son that's connected to the line of David, connected to Jesus. It all points to my final point with you this morning. God is always at work. God is always at work. And if you read the book of Ruth in its entirety, you don't hear a lot of God in it. He's hardly mentioned, and I think this is done intentionally. Because I think it's highlighting that God is actually in the background, that God is in the midst of even the little things in this story, moving and aligning and using things for his purposes. It is because the grace, the hesed, the steadfast love of God that he sent Jesus through the line of David, which is all the way traced back to Ruth's son Obed to redeem our lives. He brings us into the family of God, just like the Sharpies, giving us a home, a permanent home someday. We're no longer roaming around aimlessly. God, in essence, is our guardian redeemer. Not only in this story, but in our lives, redeeming our lives through Christ. I shared at the beginning of this story the story of Horatio Spafford. What I didn't share was that upon hearing the news of his family, he went to go be with his wife right away. So he gets on a boat and he's traveling to meet her in Europe. And he's about to pass the part or the area where his daughters had tragically died. And what he does is he goes back into his cabin and he writes the hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." How do you write those words after losing all that you have? How do you have a faith like that? How's that even possible? I would argue it's because at the heart of Horatio, he knows that God will provide all that he needs, that he knows that God's timing is perfect. And then in the midst of this awful, awful moment for him, that God is still at work. Sometimes when life gets hard and we cannot see God moving or even present, and we think he's absolutely left us, he hasn't. And in his love and in his grace, he's working. Because we know that in all things, not some things, all things, that he works for the good of those who love him, even in the midst of some of the most difficult moments in life. He provides what we need. His timing is perfect. And he's always at work for our good. Would you pray with me?